At 11:21 on the morning of March 7, 1967, 21-year-old Corporal David McKenna from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, sat motionless in elephant grass while 17 North Vietnamese soldiers walked past him close enough to touch. He had been in this exact position for 9 hours. No food, no water, no movement. His legs had gone numb 3 hours ago. A leech was attached to his neck. He could feel it pulsing but could not move to remove it. McKenna had killed 6 men in his 4 months in Vietnam, all from distances greater than 200 meters. Clean shots, professional work. But right now, with enemy soldiers close enough that he could smell the fish sauce on their breath, he was under strict orders not to fire. His captain back at the firebase had called his mission suicidal. Command had questioned whether 6 Americans could survive a week this deep in enemy territory. Intelligence officers had bet against them coming back alive. What none of them understood was this: McKenna and his team were not there to fight. They were there to become invisible. If you want to see how 6 American soldiers survived being outnumbered 100 to 1 in the deadliest jungle on Earth, hit that like button right now. It helps us share forgotten stories like this with people who need to hear them. Subscribe if you have not already. We rescue stories from dusty archives every single day. Back to McKenna. The North Vietnamese soldiers were carrying fresh ammunition, new uniforms. They looked rested, well-fed. This was critical intelligence. It meant a major offensive was coming. McKenna needed to report this. But his radio operator, 19-year-old Danny Ortiz from Sacramento, California, could not raise anyone on the radio. They had been trying for 6 hours. The mountains were blocking transmission. The dense jungle canopy was absorbing their signal. And now 17 enemy soldiers were walking past their position, completely unaware that 6 Americans were hidden in the grass watching them. One of the soldiers stopped, 5 feet from McKenna. The man pulled out a cigarette, lit it, stood there smoking while his comrades continued down the trail. McKenna did not breathe, did not blink, did not move a single muscle. The soldier finished his cigarette, flicked it into the grass. It landed 2 inches from McKenna's hand. The soldier turned and walked away. McKenna waited 30 minutes after the last enemy soldier disappeared. Then he slowly, carefully, reached up and pulled the leech off his neck. Blood ran down his collar. He did not care. He signaled Ortiz. Try the radio again. This time it worked. The intelligence McKenna transmitted that afternoon led to an airstrike that destroyed a North Vietnamese supply depot and killed 43 enemy soldiers preparing for an offensive against American positions. McKenna never fired a shot. This is the story of the most dangerous soldiers in the Vietnam War. The men who learned that sometimes the deadliest thing you can do is absolutely nothing. The volunteers who walked into hell armed with a philosophy that contradicted everything the American military had taught them. You are a warrior. Warriors fight. Except these warriors did not. They watched. They waited. They disappeared. And they changed the war. By the spring of 1965, American military commanders in Vietnam faced a paradox that made absolutely no sense. They commanded the most technologically advanced military force in human history. They had bombers that could level entire valleys, artillery batteries that fired 24 hours without stopping, helicopter gunships, napalm, chemical defoliants, more ammunition than any army had ever possessed. They could destroy anything they could see. The problem was they could not see anything. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong controlled when battles happened. They attacked when conditions favored them and vanished when they did not. Standard American infantry battalions, 80 to 100 men moving in formation, conducted massive sweeps through the jungle designed to force the enemy into decisive battles. It was like trying to catch smoke with your hands. American commanders called it the sledgehammer problem. Tremendous power, tremendous noise, almost no contact. Intelligence officers sat in air-conditioned command centers staring at maps covered in question marks. Where were the enemy base camps? Which trails were they using? Where were the ammunition dumps? How many troops were moving through the area? Nobody knew. 26-year-old Captain Richard Morrison from Atlanta, Georgia, an intelligence officer with the 1st Cavalry Division, later described the frustration in a letter to his wife dated April 19, 1965. We drop bombs on coordinates where we think they might be. We fire artillery into areas where intelligence suggests they could be. We send infantry companies to sweep regions where maybe they were 3 days ago. We are shooting at ghosts. We are guessing. and men are dying because we are guessing wrong. General William Westmoreland, commanding all United States forces in Vietnam, understood the fundamental problem. His army was fighting blind. All that firepower meant nothing if you did not know where to aim it. You cannot win a war against an enemy you cannot find. In February of 1966, Westmoreland issued a directive to every Army division and separate brigade in Vietnam. Establish long-range patrol detachments immediately. Not next month. Not after approval from Washington. Now. Priority basis. The mission was simple in concept, impossible in execution. Send small teams deep into enemy territory. Find the enemy. Watch them without being detected. Report their locations and movements. Provide the intelligence that conventional forces could not gather. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Your job is to see without being seen. The call went out for volunteers. What happened next surprised everyone. The officers recruiting for long-range reconnaissance patrols did not lie. They were brutally honest about what the job entailed. You will operate in teams of 4 to 6 men. You will be inserted by helicopter into territory controlled by the enemy. You will be miles from any friendly forces. You will carry 70 pounds of equipment through jungle so dense you can see maybe 10 feet in any direction. You will go days without speaking. You will eat cold food. You will sleep 2 hours at a time. You will learn to remain absolutely motionless while enemy soldiers walk past you close enough to touch. If things go wrong, help might not reach you. The enemy outnumbers you 50 to 1 minimum, sometimes 100 to 1, sometimes more. And if you fire your weapon, you have probably already failed your mission. The pitch was not designed to inspire confidence. It was designed to screen out anyone who did not understand what they were volunteering for. But something unexpected happened. Men lined up. Not the poster boys for military recruitment. Not the clean-cut patriotic volunteers you saw in propaganda films. These were misfits. Loners. Men who had problems with authority. Men who were tired of the regulations and the bureaucracy and the pointless busy work that consumed garrison life. 20-year-old Marcus Webb from Knoxville, Tennessee, volunteered because he had been written up 3 times for his hair being too long. He was sick of military police harassing him over regulations that had nothing to do with being a good soldier. 22-year-old James Riley from South Boston, Massachusetts, volunteered because he had been late to formation 6 times in 2 months. His platoon sergeant had threatened him with extra duty. Riley figured if he was going to be miserable, he might as well be miserable doing something that mattered. 19-year-old Carlos Martinez from San Antonio, Texas, volunteered because he had punched a supply sergeant who called him lazy. He was facing disciplinary action. The long-range reconnaissance patrols offered an alternative to punishment. These were not men who fit the military mold. They were men who rejected it. And that is exactly what made them perfect for the job. In the long-range reconnaissance patrols, nobody cared if your boots were shined. Nobody cared if you saluted crisply. Nobody cared if you had attitude problems or spoke out of turn. All that mattered was competence. Could you read a map in the dark? Could you move through the jungle without making sound? Could you control your fear when enemy soldiers were close enough that you could hear their conversations? Could you keep your mouth shut and your eyes open and your finger off the trigger when every instinct was screaming at you to fight? If you could do those things, you were welcome. If you could not, you washed out fast. The training separated the competent from the confident. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam Recondo School in Nha Trang became the crucible where volunteers either became ghosts or went back to regular infantry. Recondo stood for reconnaissance and commando. The name was the mission. The school was not designed to teach you how to fight. Every American soldier already knew how to fight. Infantry training drilled that into you until it was instinctive. See the enemy. Fix them with fire. Flank them. Kill them. Aggression. Violence. Speed. Recondo School taught you to unlearn everything you knew about being a warrior. The instructors were Special Forces veterans with multiple tours in Vietnam. Men who had survived situations that killed most people. Men who understood that the jungle did not care about your rank or your training or your courage. The jungle killed you if you made mistakes. And they were not there to coddle students. Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes, an instructor with 4 tours in Vietnam, addressed every incoming class with the same speech. Most of you think you are tough. You think you are warriors. You think you can handle anything. You are wrong. Half of you will wash out in the first week. The ones who make it through will learn that being a warrior in the Long Range Reconnaissance Patrols means suppressing every warrior instinct you have. Your job is not to kill the enemy. Your job is to find them and report their location so someone else can kill them. If you are firing your weapon, you have already failed. If the enemy knows you are there, you have failed. Your mission is to be invisible. Ghosts do not fight. Ghosts watch. Get comfortable with that, or get out. The physical training was designed to break bodies. Students ran miles in heat that turned their uniforms into soaked rags within minutes. They learned to rappel from helicopters moving at 40 miles per hour. They practiced calling in artillery strikes with coordinates so precise that being off by 50 meters meant killing your own team instead of the enemy. They carried rucksacks loaded with rocks to simulate operational weight. 70 pounds, 80 pounds. They humped those loads up mountains until their legs gave out. Then they did it again. But the physical torture was not the hard part. The psychological reorientation was what broke most men. You had to unlearn everything you knew about combat. Infantry doctrine taught you to assault through objectives, close with the enemy, destroy them through superior firepower and aggressive maneuvering. Recondo school taught you that aggression got you killed. You had to learn patience that bordered on inhuman. You had to learn to control fear responses that were hardwired into your brain. You had to learn to suppress the urge to move when staying still caused physical pain. They practiced in the jungle outside Nha Trang. Instructors would hide students in dense vegetation. Then they would walk patrols past them. Enemy role players. Sometimes actual Vietnamese soldiers hired to test the students. If the patrol spotted movement, the student failed. If they heard sound, the student failed. If they detected presence in any way, the student failed. Students had to remain motionless for hours while insects crawled on their faces, while leeches attached to their skin, while cramps seized their muscles, while fear told them to run. Some men could not do it. The psychological pressure was too much. They washed out. The ones who passed learned something profound about themselves. They learned they could endure things they never thought possible. They learned that fear could be controlled, that instincts could be suppressed, that the mind was stronger than the body if you trained it properly. And then came the final test. The final exercise at Recondo school was not a simulation. There were no blank rounds, no safety observers, no controlled environment. The instructors sent students into actual enemy territory on a live combat patrol. Real enemies, real danger, real bullets. The mission parameters were simple. Insert by helicopter. Move to an assigned observation point. Gather intelligence on enemy activity. Extract after 72 hours. If you came back alive with actionable intelligence, you passed. If you did not come back, you did not pass. This was not hyperbole. Students died during graduation exercises. On August 9, 1966, a 6-man student patrol was compromised during their graduation exercise. Enemy forces surrounded them. A firefight erupted. 2 students were killed. 3 were wounded. The 6th man, 23-year-old Corporal Thomas Wade from Michigan, called in an airstrike on his own position to break the enemy assault. Wade survived. He graduated. The 2 dead students were sent home in flag-draped coffins. The school did not apologize, did not change procedures, did not soften the exercise, because this was the job. This was the reality graduates would face every single day. Better to learn it during training than during an operational mission where failure meant an entire team died. The live graduation exercise served another purpose beyond testing skill. It forged bonds stronger than family. A 6-man team that survived 72 hours in enemy territory together had validated their trust in each other under conditions where failure meant death. They had proven they could depend on each other absolutely. 24-year-old specialist Richard Kowalski from Chicago later described his graduation patrol in a letter to his brother. We were in the jungle for 3 days. We saw enemy soldiers every single day. At one point, they were close enough that I could have reached out and touched one of them. My team leader never panicked. My radio operator stayed calm when the radio failed. My point man spotted an ambush before we walked into it. These men saved my life. I saved theirs. We are not friends. We are not brothers. We are something deeper than that. We are the only people on earth who understand what we just went through. That bond would sustain them through what came next. Every mission started with the same ritual. Pre-dawn darkness. Helicopter pad. 6 men loading rucksacks that weighed between 60 and 75 pounds, depending on mission length. Then came the noise discipline check. Every piece of equipment that could make sound was taped down or removed. Dog tags were taped together with olive drab tape or worn inside boots where they could not jangle. Metal buckles on rucksacks were covered with cloth or removed entirely. Canteen caps were tied to canteens with paracord to prevent them from rattling loose. Ammunition magazines were checked for squeaky springs. Weapons were inspected to ensure no metal parts could clink together. If your gear made noise when you moved, you did not go on the mission. Simple as that. The helicopter ride to the insertion point was loud, violent. The Huey blades hammered the air with a sound that could be heard for miles. Door gunners manned M60 machine guns, scanning the jungle below for muzzle flashes or anti-aircraft fire. The team sat in silence, each man alone with his thoughts, each man running through the same questions. Is the landing zone hot? Are enemy forces waiting for us? Will we take fire during insertion? There was no way to know until the helicopter descended. The pilot would circle the landing zone once at high altitude. Quick reconnaissance, looking for smoke, movement, anything suggesting enemy presence. Then came the descent. The Huey dropped like a stone, spiraling down to minimize time spent in range of ground fire. The door gunners tensed, fingers on triggers, eyes scanning the tree line. The helicopter flared hard at the last second. Nose up, rotor screaming. It hovered 3 feet above the elephant grass. Go. The team jumped, spreading into an immediate defensive perimeter. Weapons oriented outward, eyes scanning for threats. The Huey lifted off immediately, gaining altitude fast. The rotor wash flattened the grass and threw dust everywhere. The sound was deafening, and then it faded. The jungle swallowed the team. The silence returned. This was the most dangerous moment of the entire mission. The first 60 minutes after insertion were when most teams got killed. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong were not stupid. They knew Americans inserted reconnaissance teams by helicopter. They knew the likely landing zones. They posted trail watchers near probable insertion points. They dispatched scouts to investigate helicopter activity. American teams used deception tactics. Helicopters would land briefly in 3 or 4 locations before dropping the actual team. False insertions designed to confuse enemy observers. But the enemy adapted. They investigated every landing. They tracked helicopter flight patterns. They positioned quick reaction forces to respond when Americans were detected. The first hour was a waiting game. The team would move quickly from the landing zone to dense jungle cover. Maybe 200 meters. Far enough that they were not sitting in the open. Close enough that they had not left an obvious trail. Then they stopped, formed a tight defensive circle, backs together, weapons oriented outward, and they listened. 30 minutes minimum, sometimes an hour, sometimes longer. Absolute silence. No movement, just listening. The jungle was never quiet. Birds called, insects buzzed, wind rustled vegetation. Animals moved through undergrowth. Rain dripped from leaves. The team had to distinguish natural sounds from human sounds. Footsteps sounded different from animal movement. Equipment made specific noises. Voices carried differently than bird calls. And there were tricks the enemy used. A Viet Cong scout might imitate a monkey to signal other scouts. A North Vietnamese trail watcher might snap a branch deliberately to flush out hidden Americans. The team had to identify every sound, determine if it was threat or background noise, make life or death decisions based on auditory information alone. 21-year-old Private First Class Daniel Rees from Columbus, Ohio, described his first insertion in a letter home dated November 4, 1967. We sat in the jungle for an hour after the helicopter left. I heard everything. Birds, insects, something moving through the brush, maybe 50 meters away. My team leader never moved. He just listened. After 40 minutes, he signaled the radio operator. Try to raise the fire base. The radio worked. We reported successful insertion. Then we waited another 20 minutes before moving. My team leader later told me he heard voices during that first hour. North Vietnamese soldiers talking, maybe 100 meters away. We were that close to being discovered, but we stayed still, stayed quiet, and they never knew we were there. Only after the team leader was satisfied that the area was secure would the patrol begin moving toward its objective. Slowly, movement in the jungle was nothing like movement in training. The terrain was hostile in ways that defied description. Triple canopy jungle where sunlight barely penetrated. Vegetation so dense you could see maybe 10 feet ahead. vines that caught equipment and made noise, thorns that tore clothing and skin, roots that tripped you, mud that sucked at your boots. And every step had to be silent. The patrol moved in single file. Standard formation. 6 men spread over maybe 15 meters. The point man led. His job was to spot danger before the team walked into it. Tripwires, booby traps, ambushes, enemy positions. He moved slowly, testing each step before committing his weight, scanning the ground ahead, looking for disturbed soil, fresh footprints, cut vegetation. The second man watched the left flank, eyes constantly scanning, looking for movement, listening for sounds. The third man watched the right flank. Same job, different direction. The radio operator stayed in the middle of the formation, protected. He carried the PRC-25 radio, 23 pounds, plus extra batteries, plus his weapon and ammunition, plus his share of team equipment. He was carrying close to 80 pounds. The fifth man provided additional security, scanning, listening, ready to react. The sixth man was rear security. He walked backward half the time, watching the trail behind, making sure no enemy forces were following, making sure the team left no obvious signs of passage. In thick jungle, a professional team covered maybe 200 meters per hour. Not because they were slow, because they were careful. Each step was calculated. The point man would move forward 3 paces. Stop. Listen. Scan. Signal back that it was clear. The second man would move up. The process repeated. It was exhausting, mind-numbing. It demanded absolute concentration. One careless step could trigger a booby trap that killed half the team. One snapped branch could alert enemy forces to their presence. One moment of inattention could mean walking into an ambush. The physical toll was extraordinary. 70-pound rucksacks in 100-degree heat. Humidity exceeding 90%. No breeze under the jungle canopy. Sweat soaked their uniforms within minutes. Dehydration was constant. Heat exhaustion was a real threat. But they could not stop. Could not rest except during scheduled halts. Could not make noise or show weakness. 23-year-old Sergeant Michael Brooks from Montgomery, Alabama, later described a movement phase during a mission in May of 1968. We moved for 6 hours straight, 200 meters per hour, 1,200 meters total, less than a mile. My legs were cramping. My shoulders were screaming from the rucksack weight. I was so thirsty I would have sold my soul for water. But we could not stop. We were in enemy territory. We had a mission. So we kept moving, 1 step at a time, 1 meter at a time, silent, slow, professional. And the entire time they moved, they knew enemy forces were nearby. The equipment load for a long-range reconnaissance patrol defied logic. 6 men carrying enough gear to sustain themselves in complete isolation for up to 7 days. No resupply, no support. Everything they needed had to be on their backs. The PRC-25 radio was mandatory, 23 pounds. It was their only connection to fire support, their only way to call for extraction, their only link to survival if things went wrong. But Vietnam-era radios were inadequate for the mission. The advertised range was 5 miles. In reality, mountains blocked transmissions. Dense vegetation absorbed signals. Weather degraded performance. Teams carried spare radios, another 23 pounds, and extra batteries, 15 to 20 pounds of batteries depending on mission length. Just the communications equipment was 60 to 65 pounds distributed across the team. Then came weapons and ammunition. The M16 rifle weighed 7.5 pounds. 300 rounds of ammunition per man added another 12 pounds. If the team carried an M60 machine gun, that was another 23 pounds plus belts of ammunition. Grenades were essential. Fragmentation grenades for killing. White phosphorus grenades for marking targets. Smoke grenades for signaling helicopters. CS gas grenades for riot control. Each man carried 6 to 8 grenades, 2 pounds each. Claymore mines for setting ambushes, 3.5 pounds each. Teams carried 4 to 6 claymores depending on mission. Water was the heaviest single item, 3 quarts minimum per man. 5 quarts preferred during dry season. Water weighs 8 pounds per gallon. 5 quarts is 10 pounds of water alone. Food added more weight. Long-range patrol rations were freeze-dried meals designed to be lighter than standard sea rations. But a week's worth still weighed 8 to 10 pounds per man. Medical supplies, morphine, bandages, blood expander, antibiotics, maybe 5 pounds. signaling equipment, strobe lights, signal panels, pin flares, another 3 pounds, rope for emergency extraction, spare socks because trench foot could end your career, maps sealed in plastic, compass, notebook and pencil for intelligence gathering, cleaning kit for weapons. The total load ranged from 65 to 80 pounds depending on the individual soldier and mission parameters. Young men weighing 150 to 170 pounds were carrying loads equal to 40 to 50% of their body weight. In extreme heat, through terrain that made movement physically exhausting even without load. They learned to distribute weight carefully. Pack heavy items close to the back. Keep frequently needed items accessible. Balance the load so it did not pull you off balance. But no amount of packing skill changed the fundamental reality. It was heavy. It hurt. And you carried it anyway because your life depended on having that equipment when you needed it. The PRC-25 tactical radio was simultaneously the most important piece of equipment and the most frustrating. Without it, you could not report intelligence, could not call for fire support, could not request extraction. A team with a dead radio was already dead, just waiting for the enemy to find them. But the radios failed constantly. Humidity shorted out circuits. Rain destroyed handsets. Batteries died faster than advertised. Rough handling during movement broke components. And even when the radio worked, getting a signal out was never guaranteed. 24-year-old specialist Richard Kowalski from Chicago spent 7 hours on March 12, 1968, trying to establish radio contact with his firebase. His team was positioned on a ridge overlooking a North Vietnamese supply route. They had observed a battalion-sized element, maybe 600 soldiers, moving south toward American positions. This was critical intelligence. Exactly the kind of information long-range reconnaissance patrols were supposed to gather. But Kowalski could not transmit it. The mountains were blocking his signal. He tried everything. Extended the antenna fully. Climbed to higher ground. Strung a field-expedient antenna into a tree using paracord and wire stripped from a claymore mine. Nothing worked. His team leader, Staff Sergeant Michael Brooks, watched the North Vietnamese soldiers filing past below, so close they could see individual faces, hear conversations, see equipment details, and they could not warn anyone. Kowalski kept trying. Different frequencies, different antenna configurations, whispered transmissions hoping someone, anyone, could hear him. Finally, at 16:37 hours, the radio crackled to life. Faint, broken, but a voice. Kowalski transmitted the intelligence in a compressed burst. Battalion-sized element. Grid coordinates. Direction of movement. Estimated strength. Equipment observed. The voice confirmed receipt. Repeated the coordinates back. 3 hours later, B-52 bombers hit the area where the North Vietnamese battalion had been observed. The intelligence Kowalski fought 7 hours to transmit likely saved dozens of American lives. But not every team was that lucky. Some teams never got their radios working. They completed entire missions without ever establishing communication. They gathered critical intelligence that was hours or days old by the time they were extracted and could report it. Some teams died because their radios failed and they could not call for help when enemy forces found them. The radio was supposed to be their lifeline, but it was an unreliable lifeline attached to technology that was inadequate for the mission. They carried it anyway, because the alternative was operating with no lifeline at all. As evening approached, the team faced its most vulnerable period. They had to select a location where they would spend the night, a place defensible enough that they could detect enemy approach, concealed enough that they would not be spotted, comfortable enough that they could rest. Finding that location was more art than science. The team never moved directly into their night position. That was suicide. Instead, they would identify a probable location in late afternoon. Then they would observe it from a distance, watching for signs of enemy activity, fresh footprints, disturbed vegetation, trails nearby, anything suggesting enemy soldiers frequented the area. Only after darkness fell would they move in. The night position was usually a small clearing in dense undergrowth. Thick vegetation provided concealment. The clearing gave them space to form a defensive perimeter. They called it a logger position. The team formed a tight circle, close enough that each man could touch the soldiers on either side. Backs together, weapons oriented outward. The radio was placed in the center where everyone could reach it. Communication was done through touch. A hand on the shoulder meant wake up for guard duty. 2 taps meant stay alert. A A squeeze meant danger nearby. Talking was absolutely forbidden. Even whispers could carry in the quiet jungle night. The team maintained 50% security. 3 men awake, 3 men resting. Guard shifts rotated every 2 hours. But rest was not sleep. Not really. Soldiers learned to enter a state between consciousness and unconsciousness. Alert enough to react instantly to danger. Rested enough that their bodies could recover some energy. But never truly asleep. Some men never slept in the field at all. They just closed their eyes and rested while maintaining awareness of their surroundings. The nights were endless. Insects swarmed. Mosquitoes bit through clothing. Ants crawled into ears and noses. Leeches attached to any exposed skin and crawled under waistbands to reach protected areas. The jungle was never silent at night. Birds called. Animals moved through undergrowth. Branches creaked. Leaves rustled. Every sound had to be identified and categorized. Natural or human. Threat or background noise. A twig snapping could be an animal, or it could be an enemy soldier stepping on it. Vegetation rustling could be wind, or it could be someone pushing through it. A voice in the distance could be imagination, or it could be North Vietnamese soldiers talking. The teams developed hearing that bordered on superhuman. They could detect sounds most people would never notice. They could identify the difference between an animal footfall and a human footfall. They could hear whispered conversations from 50 meters away, and they had to remain absolutely motionless while processing all this sensory information. 20-year-old Private First Class Daniel Reeves from Columbus, Ohio, described a night in October of 1967 that he would never forget. Around 20 to 100 hours, we heard voices. North Vietnamese soldiers, maybe 30 meters from our position. We could not see them, but we could hear them clearly. They were setting up camp for the night. Talking, laughing, cooking rice. The smell of their fire reached us. Wood smoke. Fish sauce. We did not move for 11 hours. From when we first heard them until they broke camp in the morning and left. At one point, maybe 0 to 100 hours, one of them walked to within 5 meters of my position to urinate. I could see him in the moonlight. Young guy, maybe 18 years old. He looked tired. He finished, turned around, walked back to his camp. I did not breathe the entire time he was that close. My team leader later told me he had his hand on a grenade the whole time. If the soldier had spotted us, he would have thrown it and we would have run. But the soldier never saw us. He had no idea 6 Americans were lying in the grass close enough to reach out and touch him. When morning came and they packed up and left, my legs had cramped so badly I could barely stand. Took me 10 minutes just to get feeling back. But we were alive. We had intelligence on enemy positions and movements. And they never knew we were there. That was success. Both American and North Vietnamese forces observed an unofficial truce during the hottest part of the day. From noon until 1400 hours, soldiers on both sides rested. The North Vietnamese would set up defensive perimeters and post guards while the majority of troops rested in shade. American patrols did the same. The tropical sun during midday was murderous. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees. Humidity stayed above 90%. The heat was a physical weight that crushed you. Under the jungle canopy with no breeze, it felt like being inside an oven. This 2-hour period was when teams would attempt to eat. Long-range patrol rations came in varieties like beef hash, chicken stew, spaghetti, and chili. They were freeze-dried meals that weighed significantly less than standard sea rations. Soldiers universally agreed they all tasted terrible, like cardboard mixed with chemicals. Some compared it to eating sawdust flavored with salt. But taste did not matter. Weight mattered. And long-range patrol rations were light enough to carry a week's worth without destroying your back. Everything was eaten cold. Heating meals required fire. Fire created smoke. Smoke revealed your position. Some soldiers tried to rehydrate the freeze-dried meals with cold water. That made them slightly more palatable. Others ate them dry and washed them down with water. Water was the constant obsession, the thing you thought about more than anything else. During the dry season, teams ran out of water within 48 hours. They were forced to drink from bomb craters, stagnant pools, streams that looked more like sewage. The water was brown, thick, sometimes had dead animals floating in it. Iodine tablets killed some of the bacteria and parasites, made the water taste like a chlorinated swimming pool. But it was better than dying of dehydration. During the wet season, water was everywhere. So were the leeches. The jungle during rainy season was infested with leeches. They dropped from trees onto your neck and shoulders. They crawled into boots and up pant legs. They found their way under waistbands and attached to places you could not see. Soldiers would finish a 7-day patrol and discover leeches attached in their armpits, groin, and between toes. The standard removal method was burning them off with cigarettes or dabbing them with insect repellent. If you just pulled them off, the head stayed embedded under your skin. The wound would become infected. Jungle rot was ubiquitous and inevitable. Open sores that would not heal in the constant moisture. The humidity prevented scabs from forming. The sores would grow, eating away at skin on feet, hands, groin, armpits. Immersion foot was common and potentially career-ending. Feet that stayed wet for days would swell grotesquely. The skin would turn white and peel off in sheets. Walking became agony. Some soldiers had to be medically evacuated because their feet were so damaged they could not continue. Gastrointestinal diseases were even more dangerous. Parasites, hepatitis, dysentery that left soldiers dehydrated and unable to keep food down. Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol teams lost more men to disease than to enemy fire. The environment was trying to kill them just as aggressively as the North Vietnamese army. The primary mission was observation and intelligence gathering. Find the enemy. Watch them. Document their activities. Report back. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Teams would position themselves along known enemy trails and observe for days, sometimes a week. They documented everything. How many soldiers passed, what equipment they carried, what direction they were moving, whether they looked fresh or exhausted, whether they were carrying wounded, what their morale seemed like. This intelligence shaped American operations in ways most people never understood. If a team reported a battalion-sized element moving toward an American firebase, artillery would be prepositioned to defend against attack. Air support would be placed on standby. Infantry units would prepare defensive positions. If a team located an ammunition depot, airstrikes would destroy it before the ammunition could be distributed. If a team identified a headquarters element with radio antennas, B-52 bombers would level the entire area. The intelligence was critical. Gathering it required patience that most people could not comprehend. Staff Sergeant Robert Harrison from Richmond, Virginia, spent 6 days in May of 1968 watching a North Vietnamese base camp from a ridge overlooking it. 200 enemy soldiers below him. Officers holding meetings. Soldiers training. Supply trucks arriving and departing. Harrison documented everything through binoculars. When officers met, where ammunition was stored, where radio antennas were positioned, guard rotation schedules, defensive positions. For 6 days, his team did not move from their observation post. They urinated where they lay. They defecated into plastic bags that they sealed and carried with them to avoid leaving any trace of their presence. The intelligence Harrison gathered allowed American forces to plan a raid that destroyed the base camp, killed 53 enemy soldiers, and captured substantial ammunition and supplies. Harrison's team never fired a shot, never revealed their presence. 6 men watching 200 enemies for 6 days without being detected. That was professional reconnaissance. That was success. But not every mission was passive observation. Sometimes teams were tasked with kill or capture missions. Ambushes designed to eliminate enemy personnel or snatch prisoners for interrogation. These missions were fundamentally different. Aggressive, violent, high risk. The team would identify a high-traffic trail, study movement patterns, determine the best location for an ambush. They would set up just before dark, positioning claymore mines in an arc covering the kill zone. Each claymore contained 700 steel balls. When detonated, those balls would spray outward at 4,000 feet per second, shredding everything in a 30-meter arc. The claymores would be daisy-chained together. One firing device could detonate all of them simultaneously. Then came the waiting. Hours of absolute stillness. Lying in ambush positions. Muscles cramping. Mosquitoes feasting on exposed skin. Leeches attaching and feeding. Every sense straining for the sound of approaching footsteps. The psychological pressure was immense. You knew enemy soldiers were coming. You knew what would happen when they entered the kill zone. You knew that in the next few hours, men would die violently. And you had to remain perfectly still while carrying that knowledge. When enemy forces finally approached, the team leader had to make instantaneous tactical decisions. Is this patrol small enough that we can handle them? Or is this a company-sized element that will overwhelm us if we initiate? Do we wait for them to fully enter the kill zone? Or detonate early if their point man seems alert? Are there stragglers behind the main group who will escape and report our position? All of these decisions had to be made in seconds while adrenaline was spiking and fear was screaming at you to act. If the patrol was manageable, the team leader would initiate. The claymores would erupt with a sound like thunder. The kill zone would be shredded by thousands of steel balls traveling faster than bullets. Immediate carnage. Bodies torn apart. Survivors screaming. Confusion and smoke. Then rifle fire. Controlled bursts into the kill zone, targeting anyone still moving. The entire ambush from initiation to cessation of fire lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then came the dangerous part. The team would move into the kill zone quickly, grab weapons from the bodies, search for documents, maps, anything with intelligence value. If possible, grab a wounded prisoner who could be interrogated. You had maybe 3 minutes before enemy reinforcements arrived. Every soldier within a kilometer would have heard the explosion. They would be converging on the ambush site. Quick reaction forces would be mobilized. The team had to grab what they could and get out fast. The radio operator would be calling for extraction. The team would move rapidly toward a pre-designated landing zone, abandoning stealth for speed, crashing through vegetation, running. Break contact drills became critical. If enemy forces caught up before the team reached the landing zone, they would execute practiced procedures. The point man would fire forward and throw a grenade, then move. The next man would do the same while the point man reloaded and moved again, leapfrogging backward under fire, each man covering the others, maintaining suppressive fire while retreating toward extraction. It was controlled chaos executed through muscle memory and training. Sometimes they made it to the landing zone before being overrun. Sometimes they did not. Prisoner snatches were among the most dangerous assignments a long-range reconnaissance patrol team could receive. The intelligence value of a live prisoner was enormous. Someone who could be interrogated about enemy unit compositions, future operations, supply routes, command structure. But the mechanics of capturing a prisoner alive under combat conditions were brutal. The team would study enemy movement patterns and identify a specific target, usually someone walking in second or third position in an enemy patrol, often identifiable as an officer or NCO by possession of a pistol, map case, or radio. The ambush would be set up similarly to a kill ambush. Claymores positioned, team concealed. But when the ambush was initiated, 2 designated team members would sprint from concealment toward the target while the rest of the team provided covering fire. What followed was hand-to-hand combat in the mud and vegetation, trying to tackle and subdue a man who was fighting desperately for his life, trying to gag him so he could not scream, trying to bind his hands while his comrades were shooting back from the jungle and your own team was laying down covering fire. It was violent, primal, terrifying. And if you succeeded, extraction became exponentially more difficult. Now you had to move through dense jungle toward a landing zone while dragging or carrying a struggling, non-compliant prisoner who was doing everything possible to slow you down or escape. The prisoner would try to grab vegetation to slow your movement, would try to make noise to alert nearby enemy forces, would fight against restraints. You could not afford to be gentle. Speed was survival. You would drag him through mud and vines, hit him if necessary to keep him quiet, do whatever was required to get him to the landing zone. It was the longest, heaviest mile any team ever walked. Veterans later described prisoner snatches as the missions they hated most. The violence was personal, close range. You saw the terror in the prisoner's eyes. You felt him struggling. You heard him trying to scream through the gag. It was war stripped of any pretense of clean or honorable. But the intelligence gained from successful prisoner snatches saved American lives. Prisoners revealed upcoming offensives, supply cache locations, unit movements. So the teams executed the missions. Professional, efficient, brutal when necessary. When things went catastrophically wrong, when teams were compromised and enemy forces were closing in, emergency extraction was the only option. The radio operator would be screaming into the handset, calling for immediate extraction, providing grid coordinates, describing the tactical situation. Helicopter crews would scramble. Door gunners would load belt ammunition into M60 machine guns. Pilots would spin up rotors. The team would be moving fast toward the nearest possible landing zone. Sometimes a clearing they had identified during insertion. Sometimes just an area where the jungle canopy was thin enough that a helicopter might be able to get down. The landing zone was almost never secure. Enemy forces would be pursuing, sometimes already firing at the team. The helicopter would come in fast and low, pilots pushing the aircraft to maximum speed, door gunners scanning for threats. If the landing zone was big enough and relatively clear, the helicopter would land for maybe 10 seconds. The team would pile in, wounded thrown aboard first, equipment abandoned if necessary. The helicopter would lift off immediately, gaining altitude as fast as possible while door gunners hosed down the tree line with machine gun fire. Tracer rounds would be streaking through the air. The sound of bullets hitting the helicopter was a sharp metallic ping. Sometimes door gunners were hit, sometimes pilots, sometimes the team members still boarding. If the landing zone was too small or too hot, they used Maguire rigs. Extraction harnesses dropped from a hovering helicopter. The team would clip into the harnesses and be lifted out through the jungle canopy while door gunners provided covering fire. Being extracted on a Maguire rig was one of the most terrifying experiences in warfare. You dangled beneath the helicopter, completely exposed, being pulled up through branches and vines that tore at your uniform and equipment, rising through the canopy while tracer rounds snapped past your head. The helicopter would bank and turn to avoid ground fire. You would swing wildly on the rope, spinning, bouncing off tree branches. Men were hit during Maguire extractions, shot while hanging helplessly beneath the helicopter. Some fell when ropes were cut by enemy fire or when they lost their grip. But Maguire extraction was better than the alternative. Being overrun, captured, tortured, killed. The teams fought desperately to reach extraction points. They understood that extraction under fire was their only chance at survival. Amidst all the violence, veterans occasionally spoke of encounters that defied easy explanation. Moments when professional soldiers on opposite sides made silent calculations and chose not to fight. Staff Sergeant Thomas Murphy from Boston described one such encounter in November of 1968. His team was moving through dense jungle when they emerged onto a trail at the exact same moment a North Vietnamese reconnaissance team emerged from the opposite side. Both teams froze. 6 Americans, 5 North Vietnamese. Weapons raised. 10 meters separation. Murphy could see the enemy team leader's face clearly. Young, maybe 25. Thin, alert eyes. In that frozen moment, both leaders made the same calculation. If anyone fires, everyone dies. The range is point blank. The jungle is dense. There is no cover. Automatic weapons will shred both teams in seconds. Murphy slowly lowered his rifle. Just an inch. He raised his other hand. Palm out. Stop. The North Vietnamese team leader watched him for what felt like an eternity, but was probably 3 seconds. Then the enemy leader lowered his weapon, raised his hand. Same gesture. Murphy signaled his team. Back away slowly. The North Vietnamese team did the same. Both teams faded backward into the jungle, never taking their eyes off each other. Weapons still ready, but not firing. When both teams were back in concealment, they turned and moved away quickly. 2 groups of professionals acknowledging that on this particular day, in this particular place, nobody needed to die for terrain that meant nothing to either side. Murphy never reported the encounter. What would he say? That he had enemy soldiers at point-blank range and chose not to engage. That would raise questions, create problems. So he stayed silent. But he never forgot that moment. Never forgot the look in the enemy team leader's eyes. They were not monsters. They were soldiers. Professionals doing a job. And sometimes professionals recognized each other. To survive in the jungle, American teams needed expertise that training could not provide. They got it from the most unlikely source. Kit Carson scouts. Former Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army soldiers who had defected to the South Vietnamese government through the Chiu Hoi program. These men were recruited to serve as scouts for American units. The relationship was built on tense, complicated trust. Here was a man who months ago might have been shooting at Americans. Now he was walking point for an American team. Your life depended on him making good decisions. His life depended on you protecting him if you encountered his former comrades. It was strange. Uncomfortable, but necessary, because the scouts possessed skills that Americans, no matter how well trained, could never fully replicate. They knew the jungle intimately. They understood the behavior of local wildlife. They could read signs that Americans would miss entirely. They could tell if enemy soldiers had passed through an area recently by examining disturbed vegetation, by smelling the air, by touching the soil and gauging its moisture. They could identify hidden bunker complexes by noticing subtle changes in vegetation patterns. They could hear sounds in the jungle that Americans could not distinguish from background noise. They saved countless lives. Sergeant Thomas Murphy from Boston operated with a Kit Carson scout named Tran for 9 months in 1968. Tran had been Viet Cong for 4 years before defecting. He knew the jungle better than anyone Murphy had ever met. On June 3, 1968, Tran stopped the patrol with a raised fist. Silent signal. Everyone freeze. Tran knelt, examined the ground, touched the soil with his fingers, brought them to his nose, smelled them. He turned to Murphy and whispered 2 words. Many men. The patrol moved forward carefully. 50 meters ahead, they found a North Vietnamese army company. 120 soldiers camped in a hidden clearing, cooking, resting, completely unaware that Americans were watching them. If Tran had not detected the signs, Murphy's 6-man team would have walked directly into 120 enemy soldiers. Murphy called in the coordinates. 2 hours later, artillery destroyed the camp. 53 confirmed enemy killed. Tran had saved Murphy's life. Murphy knew it. Tran knew it. The bond between them became unbreakable. Murphy later said he trusted Tran more than some American soldiers he had served with, because Tran had proven himself under conditions where failure meant everyone died. That kind of validation created loyalty that transcended nationality or previous allegiances. As the war progressed and teams became more experienced, missions became increasingly sophisticated. Some teams were tasked with tapping enemy communication lines. The North Vietnamese army strung telephone wires through the jungle to maintain communication between units and headquarters. The wires ran through trees, hidden in the canopy, connecting command posts separated by miles of jungle. American teams would locate these wires, carefully climb the trees, and attach recording devices. Then they would sit in positions near the wire for days, changing tapes, recording every conversation. The intelligence value was extraordinary. Enemy commanders discussing troop movements, supply officers coordinating logistics, political officers issuing orders, all of it recorded. But the risk was astronomical. If the wire was inspected and the device discovered, the team was sitting near enemy communication infrastructure with limited ability to escape. If enemy forces found them, they would be surrounded and overwhelmed. Some teams never came back from wiretapping missions. The ones who succeeded provided intelligence that shaped strategic decisions, revealed upcoming offensives, identified supply routes, exposed command structures. It was intelligence work at its most dangerous and most valuable. By 1969 and 1970, the war was changing fundamentally. American combat units were withdrawing under the Vietnamization program. The official policy was to train South Vietnamese forces to fight independently while American forces went home. But someone had to cover the withdrawal. Someone had to ensure that retreating columns were not ambushed. Someone had to maintain intelligence on enemy movements so American forces could disengage safely. The Long Range Reconnaissance Patrols became the fire brigade for a retreating army. They pushed out further into enemy territory. They operated more aggressively. They took greater risks. This period was psychologically complex in ways that are difficult to articulate. The teams were fighting a war that everyone knew was ending. The question hung over every mission like a weight. Who wants to be the last man to die in Vietnam? Yet operational tempo did not decrease. It accelerated. The teams had to work harder to protect forces that were withdrawing, to gather intelligence on enemy forces that were growing bolder as American presence diminished. The enemy sensed the withdrawal and became more aggressive. The North Vietnamese army moved larger units down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They brought heavy anti-aircraft guns. They brought tanks. The jungle was transitioning from a guerrilla battlefield to a conventional battlefield. The teams adapted. They targeted logistical networks, called in airstrikes on convoy assembly areas, directed artillery onto ammunition storage sites, provided intelligence that shaped the interdiction campaign. But the enemy was also getting better at hunting them. The North Vietnamese army deployed dedicated hunter-killer teams, soldiers specifically trained and equipped to track and destroy American reconnaissance patrols. The cat-and-mouse game became deadlier. Teams that had previously operated with relative impunity found themselves being hunted by professionals who knew their tactics. Survival became harder. Missions became more dangerous. Losses increased. While conventional units in rear areas suffered catastrophic morale problems, drug abuse, racial tension, and even the murder of unpopular officers, the Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol companies maintained operational discipline. They had no choice. In a six-man team operating alone miles from any support, there was no margin for internal conflict or impairment. If one man was high on heroin, everyone died. If one man refused to follow orders, everyone died. If racial tension caused team members to distrust each other, everyone died. The fundamental mathematics of their situation enforced discipline that rear area units could not maintain. The teams developed fierce, almost cult-like identities. They understood themselves as fundamentally different from everyone else in the military. They were always in the field, always operating, always focused on mission accomplishment and bringing each other home alive. This intense focus insulated them from broader institutional decay. They were professionals who did the job regardless of politics or policy or whether anyone back home cared. The deactivation came suddenly and without ceremony. By 1971, Ranger companies began standing down one by one. The 75th Infantry Regiment scaled down operations. Men were sent home, often individually rather than as intact units. This was the final trauma for many veterans. 1 week you were operating in the jungle where every sense was dialed to maximum and every decision was life or death. The next week you were on an airliner flying home. 24 hours later, you were standing on a street corner in America. No decompression period. No transition. No time to process what you had experienced. The contrast was jarring beyond human capacity to process. Veterans were called baby killers by protesters who had no understanding of what long-range reconnaissance patrols actually did. They were spat on in airports, told they were murderers. They learned to travel in civilian clothes, to never mention where they had been or what they had done. Most did not talk about their experiences, not because they were ashamed, but because explaining required making people understand a version of themselves that did not fit in civilian society. How do you explain spending 6 days lying motionless watching enemy soldiers close enough to touch? How do you explain the silence of an ambush where you killed men and felt nothing except relief that you survived? How do you explain what it feels like to dangle beneath a helicopter while tracer rounds snap past your head? You cannot. Not to people who have never experienced anything remotely similar. So they stayed silent, got jobs, married, raised children, and carried the jungle with them every single day. The transition to civilian life was brutal in ways that are difficult to articulate. Veterans tried to reintegrate. They went to work. They attended family gatherings. They tried to care about normal things. But part of them remained in the jungle. Always. They scanned tree lines in public parks. Not consciously. It was automatic. Ingrained. They could not sit with their backs to doors. They needed to know where exits were. They needed to be able to see threats approaching. Loud noises made them flinch. Fireworks on the 4th of July sent them back to the jungle. The sound of helicopters overhead triggered responses they could not control. They woke in cold sweats because a ceiling fan sounded like Huey rotors. Because shadows on the bedroom wall looked like movement in the jungle. The hypervigilance that kept them alive in Vietnam never fully went away. It became a permanent neurological condition. Their wives learned not to touch them suddenly while they slept. The instinctive reaction could be violent. Men who would never consciously harm their families sometimes struck out in their sleep, reacting to perceived threats that did not exist. Some turned to alcohol to quiet the memories, to dull the hypervigilance, to sleep without nightmares. Others threw themselves into work, staying busy enough that thoughts could not catch up, working 12, 14, 16 hours a day, so they were too exhausted to think when they finally went to bed. A few sought help through the Veterans Administration. But mental health resources in the 1970s and early 1980s were woefully inadequate. Most therapists had no framework for understanding what these men had experienced. No training in treating what would later be recognized and classified as post-traumatic stress disorder. How do you counsel someone about the moral weight of calling artillery onto a village when you have never heard incoming fire? How do you help someone process survivor's guilt when you have never lost brothers in combat? How do you treat hypervigilance that is not irrational, but was actually the thing that kept someone alive? The therapists tried, but they were operating without adequate tools or understanding. Many veterans gave up on therapy, concluded that nobody who had not been there could possibly understand. They were probably right. The consequences of service continued unfolding decades after the war ended. Veterans developed cancers at rates significantly higher than age-matched populations. Lymphomas, leukemia, prostate cancer, lung cancer. They developed neurological disorders, peripheral neuropathy, Parkinson's disease. They developed cardiovascular disease at elevated rates. Their children suffered birth defects at rates that could not be explained by chance. The Agent Orange they had walked through, the dioxin they had consumed in contaminated water, the chemical defoliants they had breathed, all of it came back decades later. The battles with the Veterans Administration to get these conditions recognized as service-connected became a second war. A war fought with medical records and disability claims and appeals instead of bullets. The VA was slow to acknowledge the connection between chemical exposure and health problems, slow to approve disability claims, slow to provide treatment. Veterans spent years fighting bureaucracy, providing documentation, attending medical board hearings, appealing denials. Many died before their claims were approved. Their families continued the fight, trying to get recognition and benefits that should have been automatic. But the veterans endured. They survived. They built lives despite the obstacles. The reconnection process started slowly in the late 1980s and early 1990s. A phone number passed through mutual friends. A letter forwarded through Veterans Administration records. An internet search when the web became available. Men who had not spoken in 20 years would connect, arrange to meet at a hotel or VFW hall. And within minutes of seeing each other, the decades would dissolve. They would fall back into old patterns. The dark humor that outsiders found disturbing, but they found comforting. The shorthand communication. The shared references that nobody else understood. They talked about guys who did not make it back. Kept those memories alive when official records had reduced their friends to names on a wall. They talked about specific missions, specific moments, specific decisions that had haunted them for years. These gatherings became sacred spaces where they could finally process trauma that had been bottled up for decades. Here they could admit to fear without being judged as weak, could admit to nightmares without being treated as broken, could talk about the violence they had participated in without being seen as monsters. They could laugh about absurdities. The time the Kit Carson scout saved the team because he could smell fish sauce on enemy breath from 50 meters away. The time they had to abort a mission because the team leader stepped on a hornet's nest and they were too busy fighting insects to watch for North Vietnamese soldiers. They could cry about losses. The point man who took the first burst of fire saving everyone else. The radio operator who got them extracted before dying from his wounds. The helicopter crew that came in under fire to pull them out and never made it home themselves. The bonds forged in the jungle proved unbreakable across decades. These men would drive across multiple states to attend a teammate's funeral. They helped each other through divorces when marriages collapsed under the weight of trauma and PTSD. Through job losses when hypervigilance made normal employment impossible. Through health crises when Agent Orange-related cancers appeared. When one of them was diagnosed with terminal cancer, the others rallied. They navigated VA bureaucracy together, attended medical appointments together, made sure no brother faced the final battle alone. The same loyalty that kept them alive in Vietnam sustained them through everything that followed. Every Memorial Day and Veterans Day, survivors make pilgrimages to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. They bring photographs, letters, dog tags, items that belong to teammates who did not come home. They find the names on the black granite wall, trace them with their fingers, sometimes break down in public in ways they never allowed themselves to do in private. They tell stories to tourists who happen to be nearby, trying desperately to make people understand that these names were not just statistics. They were real people, guys with families and futures that ended in the jungle. The guy who always had a joke before insertion, who could make you laugh even when you were terrified. The point man who could read a trail better than anyone, who spotted tripwires and ambushes that would have killed the whole team. The radio operator who never gave up trying to raise communications even when it seemed hopeless, who got through when it mattered most. The team leader who made impossible decisions and carried the weight of those decisions for the rest of his life. The rear security man who held off an entire North Vietnamese platoon so the rest of the team could reach the extraction point, who died so his brothers could live. Veterans introduced their children and grandchildren to names on the wall, ensuring that another generation knows who these men were and what they gave. The names represent lives, families, losses that echo across generations. In the 50-plus years since the war ended, as documents have been declassified and veterans have finally shared their stories, the full scope of Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol contributions has become clearer. They operated in the most dangerous areas of Vietnam: the A Shau Valley, the Ai Drang, the Central Highlands, the border regions with Cambodia and Laos where enemy forces concentrated. They went where conventional infantry companies hesitated to go, where the enemy felt safe, where American presence was minimal or non-existent. They walked trails that were highways for North Vietnamese movements, set up observation posts within sight of enemy headquarters, conducted missions so deep in enemy territory that extraction was sometimes impossible. They did this knowing that if things went wrong, help might not arrive in time, that they could be overrun and killed before anyone even knew they were in trouble. This was their war, silent, terrifying, fought in corners of Vietnam where maps ended and jungle began. They were the eyes behind the lines, the watchers in the darkness, the ghosts who saw everything and were never seen, and their watch never truly ended. Even now, 50 years later, the survivors carry the jungle with them, carry the memories of brothers who did not make it home, carry the weight of decisions made in split seconds under impossible pressure. They ask for nothing except respect and remembrance, nothing except that their brothers not be forgotten. The long-range reconnaissance patrols of the Vietnam War represent more than military history or tactical innovation. They represent young Americans who walked into hell and came out permanently changed, who carried the weight of what they saw and what they did for the rest of their lives, who proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing, that sometimes survival means suppressing every warrior instinct and becoming invisible. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to control fear and do the job anyway. Their legacy lives on in every modern special operations unit that values small unit effectiveness, in every reconnaissance team that operates behind enemy lines, in every soldier who understands that intelligence and stealth can be more valuable than firepower. But their most important legacy is harder to quantify. They proved what humans are capable of enduring when training, leadership, and brotherhood create something stronger than individuals. They showed that 6 men who trust each other absolutely can accomplish things that seem impossible. They demonstrated that professional soldiers do the job regardless of politics or policy or whether anyone back home appreciates it. They embodied principles that remain relevant for any military operating in any era. That small teams properly trained and led can have strategic impact. That volunteers motivated by mission and brotherhood outperform conscripts. That technology enables, but humans accomplish. The specific tactics and equipment they used have been superseded, but the fundamental lessons remain. This story moved us when we discovered it in archives and veteran testimonies. If it moved you, do us a favor right now. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to recommend this story to more people. People who need to understand what these men endured and accomplished. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories like this from dusty military archives every single day. Real people, real heroism, real sacrifice. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. United States? United Kingdom? Canada? Australia? Somewhere else. Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in Vietnam. Tell us if this story connected with you. Just let us know you are here, that you heard this story, that these men will not be forgotten. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for making sure the long-range reconnaissance patrols are remembered. These soldiers walked into darkness so others would not have to. They carried that burden for the rest of their lives. They deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen. The LRRPs, the ghosts of the jungle, the eyes behind the lines. They did the job. They brought their brothers home when possible. They never stopped watching, and we will never stop telling their story.